really great to be here. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Armitage. I'm a social scientist with the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, which is in Missoula, Montana. It's part of the Forest Service Research and Development branch, and we focus primarily on wilderness, though our work kind of is more broad than that typically. I do a lot of work around recreation management, and which is in part what I'm here to talk about today. And there's no name on this slide because I'm going to introduce a whole team of people who deserve tons of credit. And I'm just kind of our spokesperson for today. So we'll get to that here in a second. But what we're going to talk about is an allocating recreation guidebook. And, I'll focus a little bit on wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, maybe more so in the discussion. Hopefully there's some good discussion at the end. But we're going to introduce this research-based planning and management guidebook, which is starting to kind of catch on and get a little bit of legs, and we've introduced it to some folks and trained some folks with it, and it's been pretty well received. So we're just going to kind of walk you through that, and I'm going to really focus in three areas. Where did this guidebook come from, and kind of how was it developed? What is the guidebook? And so I'll kind of walk you through that, and then where are we going to go with it now and kind of in the future. So our team. Here's kind of a list of folks. It's really researchers and practitioners, and folks have been involved in different facets. But I really want to shout out the top folks here who are Kelsey Phillips, who was kind of the lead of this guidebook. And she was a resource assistant with the Forest Service formerly, not anymore. Now she's with the County of Missoula. But she was a student at the University of Montana with Will Rice, who's an associate professor there. And they worked really closely together and really were leaders on this work, particularly the study that interviewed managers, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then developing the guidebook as well. And then a shout out to Abby Fiesler, whose name you'll see on a couple of these presentations or a couple of the publications as well. She's a PhD student at the University of Montana, and really lately has been heavily involved in a great leader in where we're going with this work. So developing trainings and kind of organizing those and that type of thing. So often, students and young professionals are so involved and drivers of this work, and I want to give them their credit here. And then in addition to those three at the University of Montana, or formerly at the University of Montana, if not still, myself and Jacqueline Rushing here at the Leopold Institute. Liz Townley, who's part of the National Forest System, has been part of the Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers program for a very long time. Right now is doing a lot of work around the Explore Act, has been a real thought partner and co-producer and supporter of this work and kind of driver of this work. And so it's a really good team here. And we've got some university partners as well who are involved in some of the early studies. And we're excited to see where it goes, but it's a really co-produced research, external partnership, National Forest System project. And there's a lot of facets of it, but it's been supported by research and development as well as the Wilderness, Wild and Scenic Rivers program. So shout out to all those folks. Okay, so before we get started, it talks about recreation allocation as this guidebook, right? So what do I mean by that? When a use limit or visitor capacity is either implemented, maybe it's a permit system, or comes about by virtue of the resource. And by that, we mean like maybe it's a developed camp, right, with 20 campsites. It's necessary to find a means of distributing these limited public recreation opportunities. So this isn't so much about the choice to allocate recreation. A lot of times, say it's in a permit system consideration, or you're going to implement a permit, or maybe you're not going to implement a permit. That's the choice to allocate that recreation. There's a lot of work around that. Wild and Scenic Rivers, for instance, require that with the visitor capacity. I mean, they don't require that you actually allocate it, but they set this kind of right threshold where you would potentially be forced to take some management action if that capacity is exceeded. And that doesn't always have to be use limitations, to be clear. But once you make that decision to do it for whatever reason, maybe it's a decision managerial for an area or a wild and scenic river, it's a campsite that only has 20 sites, and you're kind of de facto allocating those sites, right? So what does that actual allocation process look like? And that's what we mean by recreation allocation. So We can talk about that choice to allocate or not to allocate, and it's an important one and one that I've done a lot of work on and have a lot of opinions on, but we're not going to discuss that so much here today. It's more like we made the choice. Now what? How do we design this system, right? And so just to get us on the same page really about some basic terminology, we can think about allocation or of use in two kind of ways. The first is allotment. So are you divvying up those limited recreation opportunities to between user groups of some kind? Maybe it's private boaters or commercial guides in this case, right? Or commercial allot to different user groups. So that's part of it. So then you allot different user groups, or maybe you don't. Maybe it's all, all user groups are kind of being allocated within the same system. But then there's the rationing portion. So we have allotment, that's between groups. And then rationing, we think about within groups. So what are the mechanisms you're using to actually ration those recreation opportunities within, say, the private boater community? Maybe it's, or the private camper community. This is a good example for campsites, right? Developed campsites, maybe you've got 20 of them in a loop, and 15 of them are first come, first serve, and 5 of them are reservation only, or 8 are first come, first serve, and 2 are reservation only. So you're starting to think about, okay, now we have this chunk of opportunities that we're going to allocate or ration this group. How are we going to go about doing that? So trying to just set some real basic terminology here. And so the question comes, why develop a guidebook on recreation allocation? And we emphasize 3 points here. First is there's a lot of research and guidance around the choice to allocate. So there's a lot of work that looks at, who maybe wins or loses if you kind of implement a permit system. And we've seen a lot of research around who maybe is disadvantaged from those types of systems and that type of thing. But there's less focus on the how. So it's like, how do you do this? Do you do it in how many booking windows, or when should your reservations become open? Those types of questions, the nuances of the systems and the design of those allocation systems. So again, the actual distribution of those recreation opportunities, there's really not a lot of work on that. And we kind of recognize that gap. That's both in the literature and then maybe both in the guidance, right? You can think about frameworks that we may all be familiar with, like the more recent interagency visitor use monitor or management framework, right? They kind of get you to this place where maybe there's capacity established and some management actions associated with that capacity. But what do the details of an allocation system, if that's part of your management actions, look like? Not a lot of on it. Another reason we felt this was important is that recreation allocation is highly controversial. And this is both the choice to allocate, but also how you design that system. And there may be an opportunity to mitigate impacts through allocation systems, right? So our goal often is trying to accommodate as many people as possible, as many different types of recreationists. Maybe we have the planning folks who can book way in advance, or we have the folks who like spontaneity. Maybe they're local and they just want to wake up in the morning on a Saturday and go for a hike. There's ways through allocation systems that you can accommodate those different folks. So you'll be able to kind of mitigate the impacts of some kind of allocation system, because we know it's going to be controversial. Generally, you're always going to have some significant slice of folks, research shows, that just don't want it or reject that allocation system. So at least speak to those different people and those different perspectives and tell them that they're heard and you're doing your best to accommodate them, we think is a good reason to really think thoroughly through this. And then lastly is kind of a broader point, which I'm sure we're all quite familiar with. Public lands recreation demand is increasing. More folks are using public lands over time, and that's a really good thing. That means the public's getting out there and reaping the physical, emotional, mental health benefits that our public lands provide. That said, it comes with challenges as well. So those opportunities bring challenges. And so more and more, I think, managers on the ground and partners who are often integral in this work are facing these decisions and may some kind of approach that may allocate or ration recreation. And so what do those what do those systems look like? that's those are kind of the three broad reasons why we think a guidebook would be helpful. And so to kind of hammer this point home, the literature, and I think it's broadly familiar to most people, that we really want a mosaic of recreation opportunities. The recreation opportunity spectrum framework, for instance, that's kind of at its core. Like we have this, idea that we want different experiences for different people. There's no average camper, quote unquote, right? So trying to provide different experiences will cover your bases a little bit lower, if you will, right? But that's not always the case in recreation rationing. And so here's one example um, that Rice, who's integral in this work, and some of these slides are taken from some of his presentations. He did some work here in Rocky Mountain National Park, and on the top panel there, you can see, oh, these campsite types. We've got accessible campsites, tents and RV campsites, tent only, walk-in, got a quiet area, right? Those are accommodating different types of folks. But how those sites were kind of allocated or doled out, if you will, there's no mosaic. It's really homogenous, right? And it's 6 months in advance. And research has shown folks who can plan that far in advance are higher income, right? We can probably rattle off the things that those folks, stable jobs when they're, maybe they have, they're not gig workers, or their schedules are set way in advance. They're not shift workers or nurses or, workers at a restaurant or something like that. That's really hard to do and plan 6 months in advance. So there is an opportunity to think about the actual rationing in a way that provides a mosaic as well. Okay, so how was this guidebook developed that I'm going to hop into here in a minute? Really from two sources of scientific work. The first was interviews with managers. We interviewed 50 managers, and by we, I should say Kelsey Phillips, who is the lead of this work. That was part of her thesis. Interviewed managers who are familiar with recreation allocation systems, help design them, help implement them, help maintain and run them on the one hand. And so that's really kind of the management, the implementation side, those folks, many of whom are in this room, who actually have to do this work, right? You can think of some of what I'm going to talk about. Oh, that's theoretically good, but look, we've got constraints and it's really challenging to design these systems in a way that are flexible and so on. And so we really wanted their opinions to drive, and their realities to drive this guidebook. And then we had a systematic literature review. So then we wanted to say, okay, well, what kind of research out there could we find that really speaks to how the visitors feel about recreation allocation systems? And so we brought those two things together to kind of create our guidebook. And so I'll just do a slide each on these. We've got, I'm just going to bring these on, but we've got manager interviews, study regarding allocation decisions and system design. So there's the publication that came out of this, Kelsey on the lead. And we really asked managers in these interviews about their concerns. So what concerns do you have when it comes to allocating recreation? What are you thinking about when you do that, or why are you doing that? User groups and stakeholders considered. Who are you thinking about as you do this, right? And so these were free-flowing interviews, often, I think they were about 40 minutes in length on average. So we're really getting real in-depth conversations with managers about kind of what they're thinking about. What's worked well, if you have a system in place or you designed a system, how did it go and how did it work? And then what were the limitations of the system design, including policy or technical limitations. Recreation.gov I put as an example because we heard a lot about that, and you may all kind of be feeling that as well, where you have some kind of limitations with that rec.gov system. So that was and then what data or information needs do you have to support that allocation decision? So when it comes to making a decision around allocation, what information and data are you looking for? We also asked that question. So there's kind of these 5 buckets of semi-structured interviews, if you will, that we're covering with managers. So that was that study, and the publication is here. And all of these publications that I show, by the way, or manager reports and the guidebook included, are on Tree Search, which is a Forest Service kind of publication clearinghouse. All right, and then the systematic literature review, also published and out there, but really we looked broadly at visitor perspectives, preferences, and presumed behaviors around recreation allocation. So when faced with an allocation system, And again, not the choice, should we or shouldn't we allocate, but hey, what do you think? This is first come, first serve, reservation, lottery, those types of things. What do you prefer? Why do you prefer them? And what are your perspectives? And then how have those, changed over time? So these were the two studies that were kind of done in advance of the guidebook, and were really foundational to and underpinning to that work, which is where I'll turn. Okay, so the guidebook. We're going to walk through it here, fairly briefly. But a few things I'll say about it is, maybe it's a potential IDT team companion. If you're sitting up with a group on a unit or a district, and you're thinking about, or maybe you made the decision to allocate recreation, and you want to rethink it, or you got a developed camp that you've been using, it's been the same system for 20 years, and you're wondering, we're getting a lot of no-shows. Is there a way we can think about redesigning this, right? This guidebook, we think, could really help in that setting. It just kind of walks you through it, your considerations, um, and it can kind of help you kind of cover your bases. It really does surface the best available science that's out there through that literature review, right? We brought forward all the things that we've learned over the last 50 years. It elevates manager voices. We don't want it to seem like it's some kind of pencil pushers here in the office who are telling you, hey, this is what you should be thinking or doing on the ground. Really, it's centered around what managers have highlighted in their experiences, what's worked, what's not worked so well. We bring in some case studies, which can be pretty helpful to kind of ground some of these ideas and concepts in reality. And then it's only 22 pages long. That's maybe a hook in and of itself. As a co-author of many reports that have gone into the hundreds, and managers are usually very nice in accepting those reports, but I understand they maybe don't get read. This is pretty quick. You can really get through it pretty fast, and it provides a nice broad overview. So that's just a kind of an overview, but we're going to talk about each of the kind of three main chapters here with a little more detail. Okay, so the kind of starts, this is, I guess, a lead into chapter one, but it kind of just starts with a crash course in terminology and a history of recreation allocation. So again, surfacing that best available science, but bringing in like I started with, the idea of allotment versus rationing, approaches to allotment, whether it's historic use or even pool, or an even split, meaning you give overnight 50% and day users 50%. Or some kind of common pool resource approach as well. So we're kind of just going to highlight that existing research, get everybody on the same page with terminology, which we also think is kind of a nice benefit of this work as we move forward, and particularly in a time of change in the agency, to be able to kind of communicate to one another about our systems across the different units, for example, so you can kind of communicate with one another and learn from one another as well. So we start there. And then we kind of get started by really mapping your stakeholders and thinking about who will be impacted. So really thinking about the different groups that you have on your unit in the context of some kind of recreation opportunity. And we also make very clear, sovereign nations are different, right? So when it comes to working with tribes, you're going to have to kind of focus on tribal consultation typically. There may be a way, and there may be reason to set aside some of those recreation opportunities for tribes. And if that is the case, maybe it's due to treaty rights, those types of things. We wouldn't think of them as traditional stakeholders. So we do want to make that clear. And it's something we kind of focus on in here as well, if only briefly. Again, this is kind of a 22-page deal. So it's not like we're diving into any of these things in full extreme detail, but we do provide some kind of further reading at the end that you can dive in if you'd like. So first, you're kind of just getting started and laying the groundwork, setting that foundation. And then with that, we bring in, kind of those concerns. So we think about the stakeholders, but also on the manager side, and bring in these manager voices, thinking about the concerns when making allocation decisions. And so that could be ecological, social, and managerial were kind of the three categories that fell out through the analysis of Kelsey's interviews, using kind of a grounded theory approach to data analysis. And this really, we think, does promote that peer-to-peer learning it kind of tries to take us out of it as the middle people and really highlight the voices of those managers. And so that's kind of laying the foundation. Stakeholders, tribes are different, of course, and then what are those concerns and reasons and considerations that you're thinking about as you're uh, allocating recreation. And then we kind of jump into chapter 2 here, which is a big part of it, really the bulk. It's designing a strategy, right? And we kind of cover three main things, though we cover them sometimes across different types of recreation allocation approaches. So we start with just some obstacles and concerns, some pros and cons of different approaches, and then some potential strategies for implementing those different approaches, whether that be maybe it's a lottery, a first come first serve, advanced reservation, that type of thing. And so we kind of walk through each of those as well. So let's think a little bit about these challenges and obstacles to design and implementation. And again, using those manager voices as much as we can. So we asked this question, what went poorly or obstacles existed when designing or trialing allocation systems. And one was, this is kind of a common framework you all might be familiar with, that we kind of organize these concerns or these obstacles and challenges into, which is education, engineering, and design and enforcement. But within the context of educating visitors about the nuances of systems, that can be really challenging, particularly if you've got a lot of different kind of details, multiple booking windows, or it's available only, it starts at this time, or you have to come prepared with an extra pass that you need to have to visit parks overall or visit forests overall, those types of things. Educating visitors about the nuance is something that has been raised as a challenge. And then more fundamentally, why is use being restricted? What are the varying trade-offs that managers must navigate when developing some kind of rationing system? Educating the public and communicating to that public was something that was raised as a challenge, so something you really want to focus on as well. And then engineering and design, two things we heard a lot about was using recreation.gov or transitioning an existing or older system to recreation.gov. Maybe the platform and the website didn't have the ability to kind of do it as you did in the past, or bring in all those nuanced things that maybe provide some really good things like flexibility and accommodating different user groups. And then dealing with perennial issues that you may be familiar with if you're a rec manager, like no-shows, right? When you have a campground that's reservation only and you roll into it and it's only half full, even though everyone reserved it, that doesn't feel good. That gets the public upset, those types of things. So how do you design these systems, and how do you deal with that? And then similarly is kind of the enforcement of potentially no-shows or disincentivizing ways to game the system. We heard a lot about the idea you can on rec.gov, you can book 2 campgrounds, for instance, that are across the country. I could book a campground in New York and a campground in California on the same day, right? That doesn't seem right because I can't be in both places on the same day. So that type of thing, were raised in this context. And so we kind of walk through these challenges and obstacles, the pros and cons of different approaches, so who wins under different approaches, what are the broader implications of different systems. This is for reservations. What do we know about reservations is kind of the picture here on the left. And so that was insights from kind of the research up to this point. And then what are maybe the pros and cons? We tried to distill what works well for an individuals and groups able to plan ahead, for instance. Maybe a con is it results in some amount of no-shows, or it requires a reservation portal or system that you have to administer and support yourself. So those are maybe the challenges of such an approach. And so we kind of walk through this pros and cons for the different types of rationing systems: lotteries, reservation, first come, first serve, and so on. And we do it very briefly with just like a page like you see here, and a case study, and then we move on to that next approach. So we don't, again, it's kind of just a real nice cursory overview with the ability to dive deeper if you'd like. All right, and still thinking about design. So You can think about those obstacles and the challenges in design. You can think about the pros and cons of different approaches. We also wanted to bring in some suggestions for implementation, so for, highlights how different approaches may be paired. You might be able to have multiple booking windows. You might be able to combine some level of first come, first serve and reservations together, and really thinking through that in a structured way, to kind of ensure flexibility and really kind of meet specific and broad principles for an allocation design system. And so we walk through each of those as well. So pros and cons, in addition to some suggestions for implementation. All right, and then we wrap this guidebook up. So I won't take too much longer here on the presentation overall, so we can get to some discussion. We wrap the guidebook, we kind of bring it all together with components of efficient and fair systems. Some of the limitations faced by managers when attempting more efficient allocation strategies, we talk about that. Maybe it's the no-show challenge or technology or politics. That's a reality. We understand that. We heard that, right? You're implementing these systems not in a vacuum, but in an environment when administrations are changing, leadership is changing, all of those things. Community pressure exists. Those are realities, and we acknowledge that. I don't know that we have any silver bullets for that, other than to say we acknowledge it, and it's important to kind of communicate and talk through and make explicit to as best you can. And so we kind of bring it all together with some final thoughts. Efficient systems, fair systems, what are some of the limitations? And then we provide a little bit of a framework for thinking through your proposed system. And so, this was work that came out of Kelsey Phillips's thesis. She really thought hard and long on this framework and just really came up with what are kind of nice design principles for a recreation allocation system. We want things to be fair, equitable. And by that, we mean, to try to break a little bit through the noise now. It's really about, does everybody have an equal shot, or at least have an equal understanding at using this system? That's what we wanted to, make sure that everybody's got a chance. Is it flexible? That's a really important one. Like from a user perspective, meaning, are there different planning horizons? If you potentially can do a last minute pickup or things like that. And then also from manager perspectives, are these systems adjustable? If something's not working, are you able to go in and change it? We talk about accessible, and that's more about we're thinking, reframing maybe our language a little bit here, but accessible is like the ability to actually access that, like get into that system. Computer literacy. Is it available at time when people aren't working? If it's an advanced reservation system, that type of thing. Is it not confusing to users? We really wanted to focus on that. Is it balanced in the way it kind of strikes a balance between the access need, so members of the public can recreate, of course, but also kind of considers the preservation of the natural and cultural resources that everyone's kind of here to protect. Is it data driven? Is it grounded in some kind of understanding of your current use, where you want to go, hopefully perspectives and opinions and preferences of the public themselves, and that type of thing. And then finally, does it meet requirements? Of course, we can't lose sight of those, whether it's wilderness or wild and scenic rivers. We want it to be grounded in those requirements as well. So a nice little framework to help you think through it as you're making your decisions. And then we end as well with some key takeaways, leaning into flexibility, trying to kind of get that mosaic of rationing strategies as best you can. Research has shown that that recreationists care about fairness. They're going to be more inclined to accept a system if they think it's fair, if they have a reasonable chance at success, those types of things. And so the best you can communicate and design a system with that in mind will pay dividends down the line. Of course, you got to be cognizant of resource availability. We've heard this a lot, right? Oh, it's great to think about these complex or nuanced systems that provide flexibility and all those things. But look, we're strapped with people, budget, etc. So, of course, we always have to ground our work in reality. Transparency can improve the system navigation and fairness. When you think about rec.gov, what is the chances that you're going to win a permit? That would be nice for people to know. It might change their opinion and whether or not they throw their $6 or whatever it is into the bucket to see if they're going to get picked. And then communicate the how and the why. And that goes, I guess, across the board for most management. Actions with public lands that people care very much about is why are we making decisions and how are we making these decisions. And then lastly, there's some further reading and kind of a little bit of a checklist to help kind of facilitate the absorption of the guidebook itself and as you move forward, thinking through your system. All right, so that's the guidebook. Where do we go from here? Just a couple more slides and then let's chat for the last 15 minutes or so. We have these in-person trainings with managers. We actually recently did one on the Cleveland National Forest, our first one. We kind of centered it around this guidebook. We spent 2 days with managers on the Cleveland. They have some high use areas that they're considering, changing or adapting kind of their management approach to there. And so we've been working with them for a few years, and we went there to kind of work through the guidebook. But we also had folks from across kind of the country that came and showed up and brought their own perspectives from their own area as well. Folks from Alaska and other places, the Pacific Northwest as well, and beyond. And so we plan to do more of these kind of trainings and potentially future pilot studies as well. There's some an agreement working through that will continue this work with the University of Montana and the National Forest System to do some more kind of future pilot studies with holistic focus on VUM generally. Like recreation allocation, I think ultimately will be the topic of conversation a lot of the time, but really thinking even pre that, which I alluded to at the start, right, is that decision to restrict use or not, right? Thinking through your capacity and the adaptive management of a site and whether or not maybe certain management actions are more or less appropriate, and how do you think through that and what kind of data or information can support that decision. And so we hope to do pilot studies in the future, somewhere around 8 to 10 of them, which would potentially include one of these more recreation allocation focused trainings. And as part of that, we have a couple studies ongoing or really completed at this point that provided some applied science and support. So I'm a researcher, Jacqueline's a researcher, our University of Montana partners who are leading and integral to this work are researchers. And we're always willing and able and happy to kind of, if we can find the support to do it, to do some work on the ground to kind of understand visitors often is the approach there. And I'll highlight those here in a second. And then development of additional practice-based materials. We really want this to be applied science, right? It's hopefully not collecting dust on a shelf somewhere. So we've been working on a rationing worksheet where we take the guidebook and expand on that kind of step by step and think about, all right, let's work through this thing and create a design system here and now. And that's was part of the training. We worked through a draft version of that worksheet, and it's getting better and better. And we had 5 scenarios in this training that were real. I think one was hypothetical, but a couple were real, including the Cleveland National Forest issues. And it was fun. There was breakout groups, 4 to 5 people working through this worksheet. And in the course of 2 days, created kind of a first draft of a rationing system and designed it and considered booking windows and considered who the user groups were and all of that. And it wasn't perfect. It would certainly take more time. You're not going to make such a huge decision and complete that from start to finish in that amount of time. But real progress was made, and that was pretty exciting and to see and be a part of. And I think people really appreciated that as well. So we're going to continue to do that. And so, just to highlight the existence of these things, if these places of our interest to you, here's some applied science support that we've done previously. Both of these are available on Tree Search. I tried to do QR codes, but apparently I'm a bit of a Luddite and couldn't figure it out in time for the presentation. But if you go to Tree Search, you can find these. They exist. They're out there. The one was the Cleveland National Forest or the Palomar Ranger District. And we did a study around recreation allocation and asked visitors their thoughts. Like, well, one, do you embrace some kind of recreation allocation? And then whether or not you do embrace it, what would you want that system to look like if it existed, right? And so we asked those questions about booking windows, about first come, first serves, and so on and so forth. And we did that also in Alpine Lakes Wilderness area with really a focus on the core enchantments up there. And so that was part of this work. So I just want to make you aware that that exists, and this is the type of applied science that we can talk about on your unit as well. And then further materials in team development, here's a screenshot of an existing web page now through kind of Forest Service R&D that highlights kind of our team here. And what we see is really data-informed support and applied visitor use management on public lands. And we've got the research like you've seen here. So this would be a clearinghouse. If you can, I probably should have figured out the QR code here, because this is going to have direct links to the studies on the previous page. Some manager-oriented training materials like the guidebook, and this is where we'll hopefully post the worksheet when it's complete. Make people aware of the trainings that are upcoming and existing. Who's involved, publications, those types of things. So I think, Chelsea, that leaves us. That's really where I want to end it. I don't have much more. I wanted to leave a decent amount of time, and I believe we have 11 minutes to chat. So thanks for your time.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Chris, so much for that overview. I will just say that I wish this was a resource I had throughout my entire career because it's simple, yet it displays the complexity that goes into allocating use on our public lands and other lands. And yeah, it would have been really handy to have a visual like this when we first started talking about the Fossil Creek Wilderness or Fossil Creek area and some of our wilderness permit systems in the Rocky Mountain region when I was working there. So download this resource, use it, talk to your line officers. This is a great step-by-step guide of here's what it's actually going to take us to do what is right for the land. So definitely download those resources, check it out. And at this point, would love to open it up to questions from the group. Michelle, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, thanks for the presentation, Chris. I was just curious, some of the comments you made about like improvements to rec.gov got me
Mm.
thinking like, what does the agreement look like between the agencies and rec.gov? Like things, for example, like you can book a campground in California on the same day as New York. Like those seem like small changes to me that could be made, but I'm wondering what that sort of framework looks like to actually implement changes on rec.gov and like how much managers can request those changes or if it's like written into the contract when that bid gets released. If you could touch on that a little, it'd be really helpful.
Yeah, Michelle, it's a great question, and I think surfacing some of that stuff is key. So that's part of this, as you kind of as managers or anybody working with the systems find those like little loopholes. I think surfacing it's important. I'm certainly not in conversations with the contractor rec.gov myself, but I do know that they happen on a decently regular basis, and they are receptive to learning of those things and trying to close those loopholes as best they can. There was a recent article around bots. Maybe people saw that around kind of, I think it was in Wired, and it made the rounds, right, where it kind of highlighted swooping up those cancellations with bots, and then the regular folks don't have a chance to grab them. And it sounds like that was elevated and addressed to the extent that it could be. And I think also some maybe informed back and forth has been happening too, like in terms of, hey, actually, it's not something that's happening very often or at scale. So that's kind of comforting to hear. You read an article like that and you're like, oh my God, I'm never going to get a cancellation again. But it turns out maybe it's not happening at the scale that the concern stemmed from that. So we can learn on the flip side that maybe some of these issues aren't as much of an issue as we might think they are at first glance. That said, I guess I would hesitate to go too much further because I'm not an expert on that contract. But I think as that contract comes up for renewal, and maybe there's other people on the call that are, some of these things can be negotiated. And there are business rules, quote unquote, that we've learned about, or I've learned to kind of exists around what's doable, right? Like how many booking windows can they do? How customized can the system be? Those types of things. There's definitely limitations and constraints. And I don't have all the nitty gritty details. But as we design these systems and as the systems are designed at the unit level, and as we become more aware around what would be embraced by, say, the public, I think there's probably room to at least, um, I mean, I can't say for sure, right? But if we say, hey, like there's research that shows that 3 booking windows would be really great, can we somehow bump it up to 3? I assume that type of stuff could be discussed when the contract comes up. And I don't know how long that goes for. Maybe I've heard 5 years, and I don't know how, don't quote me on that, but I think it's coming up again for conversation. So um, that doesn't really answer your question other than to say, I think they are receptive and there are lines of communication that are open. Um, and it isn't something that's in perpetuity. So like any, contractual kind of relationship, that when that comes up for renewal, there can be further negotiations, I would presume.
Perfect. Thank you for that. We did have one question come in on chat from Morgan Somerville. And they say some areas have limited access points, some have many. Can this apply to those areas with many access points? The Appalachian National Scenic Trail.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan, for that question. Absolutely. Yeah, and as you go through the guidebook and what we have, this kind of companion rationing worksheet that we're working on, that becomes very explicit. Like you have to kind of define, and this is Wild and Scenic Rivers is a good example, right? Where you're defining the resource north of me here on the Flathead in Montana. It's a big system. It's 219 miles. Do you want to zone that system in some way and treat maybe the different segments differently, or the different classifications, the recreation versus the scenic versus the wild, differently? Do you want to do that? And so like the Appalachian National Scenic Trail, I'm not exactly sure how long that is, right? But you might think of it in different segments, and you could consider that differently. You don't have to have a homogeneous approach or the same approach across an entire resource. So as decision makers and partners and folks involved, kind of hone in on what resource they really want to focus on, or what element of, or what recreation opportunity, if you will. That's really important. But yeah, there's nothing that says you couldn't use this in a multiple access point situation, but you might take a different approach at one access point than you would in another. Or maybe not. Maybe it's the same approach across the board, but those conversations are important and are definitely made explicit. And yeah, there you go, Morgan. So yeah, so 2,200 miles. So maybe you would use ROS a little bit to guide your thinking as well, right? And like a lot of these kind of exercises, whether it's VUM broadly or walking through some other kind of decision making scenario, you're thinking about, well, what's this area for? What are we trying to provide? What are those desired conditions? So you do think about your desired conditions in this process like we would pretty much any visitor use management process.
Perfect. Thanks for that question, Morgan. And then we have Corrine, who asked another. In talking with managers about data/information that would support recreation allocation decisions, what would you say are the most commonly identified information gaps that local units experience in this type of planning?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Corrine. I think one is like current, and it's hard not to just fall back into like general visitor use management data gaps, but like current use, like how many people are out there. Um, that's a big question that is had, and now we have more and more ways to figure that out, which is exciting in terms of other secondary data and that type of thing. Um, and then also, what's the demand? One of the things we look at, and there's also creative ways to do this, like with web traffic and things like that. If you have an opportunity, say on recreation.gov, and it's filling up really quick, or it's filling up fairly quick, like how many people were trying to get that opportunity, right? And so that current level of demand is a gap, because that's important to think about, and that can drive your decision making as well. So understanding the current demand for these opportunities, the current level of use on the ground at a time, if you are thinking about implementing a new system. Um, and then, I think more and more managers and partners and all of us are more savvy thinking about these areas as part of a broader system. And so I highlighted the Alpine Lakes as one place we were looking in the enchantments, and like a lot of people go to that place. And if you do potentially change use or limit visitor use, where do all those folks go? So the impact, I think that's another thing that people think about a lot, which we don't have a lot of good information around, is that displacement effect. And some people talk like the toothpaste effect, where you squeeze it here and then folks go elsewhere. And what are those impacts going to look like? So that's kind of a gap in knowledge that we also kind of run across, I think, a fair bit. Some of the specifics that we've learned in places around like booking windows and what people prefer and those types of things likely is a gap at the unit level, but some of the lessons learned, I think, do apply. We've started to ask that question enough. So I think maybe it's not perfect, but we just do start to have some of this information at different sites. And generally, yeah, planners like to plan ahead, and people who have jobs that are stable and can plan ahead can, and others, more spontaneous type folks can't. And so, having a system that allows both of those folks an opportunity is kind of important. And I think that's probably a general takeaway that we could embrace, whether or not we have primary data on our specific unit. Those are a few things.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks, Chris. And we are at time at this point, but I do think Jen Stagner put a good question in there. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned doing these case studies, and can people reach out to you if they have an area they're interested in talking about visitor use management with, or allocating use? And you can look at possibly doing pilots or going out and doing a presentation like you did for that California forest.
Yeah, absolutely. Please, yeah, please, Jen, reach out. I think you have my email there. You can find me on Teams as well. If you're internal to the agency, I think you are. And so reach out and we'll connect. At the very least, we're happy to have a conversation and present and walk through this maybe in a little more time, with more time. And then the pilot, we are still kind of thinking and looking for those pilots. So reach on out and I can connect you with the rest of the team and we can talk about that as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Chris, and the whole team that worked on developing this guidebook. I think it will help a lot of people who are suffering from overuse at this point in time in their wilderness and non-wilderness and wild and scenic rivers areas. So all around, thank you for your time.